On a morning in November 2012, a 23-year-old university student walked into Wilson Airport carrying a bag full of cash. His name was Jeffrey Sila. At the time, most students his age were sitting in lecture halls, worrying about assignments, exams, and rent. But Jeffrey had skipped class as he had come to buy airplanes. Inside the office, an aircraft manager listened carefully as the young man explained what he wanted: a two-seater and a four-seater. The manager was stunned. Who was this kid? Jeffrey looked too young, too relaxed, and far too wealthy. Yet the cash was real, and the planes he wanted were real. And before the day was over, Jeffrey would become the owner of 2 Cessna aircrafts. For most students his age, owning a car would have been a dream, but Jeffrey was buying planes. What nobody knew was that the money behind Jeffrey's rise had not come from business, inheritance, or student loans. The trail stretched thousands of kilometers away from Kenya, across the Atlantic, and deep into one of the largest tax fraud conspiracies ever uncovered in the United States. A criminal enterprise built by members of his own family was slowly stealing from unsuspecting people. And despite international manhunts and the fall of the first generation, the business did not die. Instead, it was handed down, and Jeffrey was next in line. Welcome. This is Dark Hour Docs. Long before Jeffrey bought airplanes, there was Paul, Jeffrey's grandfather. This was the man who started it all. In the late 1990s, Paul left Kenya for the United States, and at the time, moving to America was a dream shared by thousands of Africans. He eventually settled in Kansas, but reality would later hit him hard. The success stories he had heard back home were nowhere to be seen. Instead, life became a cycle of work. He had to go from one job to another, and sometimes even a third, to keep his lights on. The American dream was proving far more difficult than he had imagined. But Paul wasn't ready to give up, as he wanted more. And eventually, someone showed him a shortcut in identity theft. It was a simple but highly profitable scheme that targeted elderly Americans living in nursing homes. Their personal information would be stolen, their social security details used to create fraudulent tax refund claims, and once the money arrived, the fraudsters disappeared. The business worked very well. Millions began flowing in, but there was a problem. Paul relied on brokers to obtain the stolen identities, and the brokers charged heavily for their services. The more money he made, the more he hated sharing it. So Paul decided to build his own operation, one he could fully control. But for that to happen, he needed 2 things: a trusted tax preparer and people with access to elderly patients, people he could trust and they wouldn't betray him. So, in 2003, Paul returned to Kenya and began recruiting. The first person he approached was his daughter, Monica Ndungi. At the time, Monica was working as a teacher in Machakos. Paul convinced her to leave her job, and then he sponsored her relocation to the United States, as her new role would be very different. She would become a caregiver. Next to be recruited were his 2 nieces, Lillian Nzongi and Loretta Wavinya. Both were brought into the plan, but each had different assignments. Loretta was an accounting graduate, and Paul sponsored her training and examinations so she could become an enrolled agent for her to qualify to work as a professional tax preparer. Lillian, on the other hand, was a KMTC graduate, and she would also become a caregiver, like Monica. And all together, they would help build the network Paul needed. By February 2005, the team was taking shape. More recruits arrived, more caregivers joined, and slowly the operation spread across nursing homes in Kansas and California. Among those recruited were Irvin, Edwin, Vincent, Moses, Aaron, Ken, and Mary. To outsiders, they were ordinary caregivers, workers helping elderly patients, building careers, and lived the American dream. But behind the scenes, every patient was an opportunity, serving as a source of valuable information, such as names, dates of birth, and Social Security details. Caregivers collected the information, passed it along to Loretta, who used the stolen identities to prepare fraudulent federal and state tax refund claims. Federal claims ranged from $4,000 to as much as $45,000, with state refunds ranging from $1,500 to $20,000. The scheme worked, and more than 300 fraudulent claims were filed. Soon, money was flowing through the network in enormous amounts, and back in Kenya, families began noticing the difference. Among those benefiting from the money was Monica's son, Jeffrey Sila. At the time, he was known as a bright student, an alumni of Alliance High School. Jeffrey was pursuing IT at the University of Nairobi and appeared to be an ordinary student. But his life was beginning to look very different. He lived in a furnished apartment in South B and sometimes drove a Mercedes-Benz and an Escalade to class. His mother had made sure of that, as the family business was thriving and the money was endless. And for a while, it seemed nobody was watching. But thousands of kilometers away, someone had begun paying attention, and the first cracks were starting to appear. For several years, the operation ran almost without interruption. But by late 2006, the amounts involved had become difficult to ignore. One particular transaction would catch attention, and this involved a large transfer sent by Paul to Nairobi in December 2006. Those investigating wondered why so much money was moving overseas and where exactly was it coming from. Federal investigators began digging, and the deeper they looked, the more suspicious things became. And eventually, the FBI had to be involved. Paul was arrested, and for the first time, the man who had built the empire found himself facing serious questions. Under pressure, he admitted involvement in fraud. Soon after, he was presented in court, but there was a problem. The investigation was not yet complete, and prosecutors needed more time to build their case. And because of that, Paul was granted bail. This was a decision they would soon regret, because the moment he walked out of jail, Paul made his move. He headed straight for the airport, boarded a flight, and disappeared. His destination was Kenya. He knew what was coming, and he wasn't waiting around to see it happen. And 6 months later, on July 2007, the FBI launched a series of raids. Members of the syndicate were arrested, one after another, and 18 people were charged with fraud. Authorities described it as a $13.1 million tax fraud conspiracy, one of the biggest cases of its kind at the time. The penalties were severe. Many members of the network, including recruiters and caregivers, received prison sentences exceeding 10 years. But the mastermind was missing. Since Paul had escaped, and from his hideout in Machakos, he watched the empire he had built fall apart. Most criminals would have stopped there and considered themselves lucky, but Paul did neither. Instead, he started thinking about the future. Now that the old operation was dead and his people were in prison, he could no longer return to the United States. And yet, he still had one valuable asset: family. Back in Kenya, his grandson, Jeffrey Sila, was growing up. He was bright and tech-savvy and was also studying IT at the University of Nairobi. Paul only saw potential in him, a pathway to rebuilding everything he had lost. So he brought Jeffrey closer. He shared ideas, contacts, and eventually everything he had learned. At that point, the world was changing quickly, and traditional fraud was becoming riskier. Despite this, another industry was beginning to explode across Africa, with digital broadcasting, paid television, and illegal streaming catching on. Jeffrey's ability to operate in the digital world made him the perfect successor for an opportunity which would appear in 2012. So on November the same year, he used an electronically issued fraudulent check to obtain $7.7 million from the United States federal government. This was more money than he had ever imagined. Suddenly, he had access to extraordinary wealth, and he knew exactly how he wanted to spend part of it. So on a day in November 2012, the young university student walked into Wilson Airport, cash in hand, ready to buy the only thing he didn't already own. He purchased airplanes, 2 of them, a Cessna 5Y CCN and a Cessna 5Y CCI. One of the aircraft would later be leased to Nairobi Flight Training Ltd. In 2013, turning the purchase into more than just a display of wealth. The purchases shocked people around him, but Jeffrey was only getting started. The rest of the money went into a new venture involving a business built around illegally tapping DSTV signals. Operating from his apartment in South B, Jeffrey hacked cable television systems serving customers in both Kenya and Nigeria. The stolen access was then resold as subscription packages, creating another lucrative stream of income. He would sell the broadcasts into West African markets, where his operation grew quickly, and before long it attracted the attention of MultiChoice Kenya and MultiChoice Nigeria. By 2015, the company had gone to court seeking protection as the stolen signals meant that their business was making huge losses. But what nobody knew was that the illegal DSTV operation was only a side business for Jeffrey. The real plan was much bigger and far more profitable. Because behind the scenes, the family was evolving. The first era had been tax refund fraud. The second involved digital piracy and DSTV cable signal theft. Now they were preparing a third generation of crime, one built around hacked emails, hacked government institutions, and diverted payments: the business email compromise scam. The business email compromise scheme needed one thing the family no longer had: someone inside the United States. That was a problem, as most of their former associates were in prison, and Paul could not travel back. He was still a fugitive. So the family turned to someone else, a man few people would have suspected, and this was Jeffrey's uncle, Robert Mooley. At the time, Robert was living in Ohio and worked as a truck driver. He was 59 years old, and by all accounts, he lived a quiet life. Unlike the others, Robert was not known for fraud and was deeply involved in church activities. He was the type of man few people would associate with criminal schemes. Despite lacking financial security, retirement was approaching fast, and despite years of work, he had little to show for it. Jeffrey knew that, and in 2016, he traveled to the United States. He went there partly to cash a fraudulent check, but also to convince Robert to join the family business. The pitch was simple. Robert would not have to hack anything, he would not have to create fake identities, and his role was much smaller. All he had to do was submit invoices and receive money while still at work, and the rest would be handled elsewhere. It sounded easy, and more importantly, it sounded profitable. Eventually, Robert agreed, and the plan was now in motion, with each member having their own role. Jeffrey would handle the technical side, his specialty being cloning email addresses belonging to legitimate service providers that worked with U.S. government agencies. Once the fake email accounts were ready, messages would be sent requesting changes in payment details. The government would think they were paying genuine suppliers, but the money would end up elsewhere. However, while Jeffrey was still in the United States, the FBI received information about a deal he was trying to arrange. Someone in his team was an informant. They watched and waited as he completed transactions and pounced as he boarded a flight at Los Angeles International Airport. The aircraft sat on the tarmac awaiting clearance for a journey that would eventually take him from the U.S. through London and back to Nairobi. He never left as FBI agents moved in before the plane departed. Despite his arrest, the operation would surprisingly still go on without him. Jeffrey had already shared the plan with his younger brother, Edwin Sila. The scheme continued from Kenya, and Edwin helped run the operation while coordinating with Robert in Ohio. Soon, they selected their first target within the city of Detroit, and Robert submitted one of their fraudulent invoices. Everything worked out. A payment of $750,000 landed in his personal account, and this was proof of concept. The family now knew they had found another gold mine and were content about expanding their operations. The next step would involve a company called Rogrom Home Improvement, registered years earlier on September 14, 2005, by their grandfather, Paul, and was put under the agency of Robert Mooley. It had a business account at First Commonwealth Bank in Ohio, which would be used in a much bigger scheme. The scheme involved Fairfax County, Virginia, which was preparing to pay for a large computer supply contract involving Dell Computers, and the payment was worth millions. With help from insiders, they got email addresses belonging to Dell from Fairfax County, and from a cyber cafe in Kenya, Edwin cloned Dell's legitimate email address. The team first requested a change of payment details and provided new bank details of the First Commonwealth Bank. The money was then sent to the account belonging to Rogrom Home Improvement after approval by county officials. They believed they were paying Dell, but they were not. Instead, between August 8th and September 8th, 2018, Fairfax County transferred approximately $1.3 million. And while county officials waited for their computers, the money was disappearing in thin air. Robert quickly withdrew the funds and sent large portions to Kenya. He moved the money through a series of accounts, with transfers being traced from Ohio to multiple accounts across different countries, before portions eventually surfaced in Nairobi. By then, following the money had become far more difficult. The family celebrated, and their operation was working again. Millions moved, and retirement was beginning to look very different for Robert. But far away, someone had started connecting the dots. A young FBI agent, fresh out of the FBI Academy at Quantico, was assigned a file involving suspicious financial transactions affecting county governments. His name was Jeff L. Sherratt, and he wanted results. By mid-2019, county sheriffs across different jurisdictions had been reporting unusual losses, payments going missing, invoices being altered, and money ending up in the wrong accounts. At first, the cases seemed unrelated, but Agent Sherratt wasn't convinced. He began comparing records, following transactions, tracing bank accounts, and slowly a pattern emerged. It involved the same names, the same methods, and the same accounts. Then, Robert made one final mistake. Believing that nobody was watching, he carried out another fraudulent transaction involving a county in Vermont. The amount was small, just $3,900 compared to everything that had come before, but it was enough. That transaction alone helps Sharrock connect Robert to several larger fraud schemes, including more than $769,000 in Detroit, more than $2.1 million connected to Fairfax County, and an arrest warrant was issued. For nearly 2 decades, the family had built fraud operations stretching from nursing homes in America to cyber cafés in Kenya. They had gotten away with stealing identities, filing fake tax returns, hijacking government payments, and moving millions across continents. Despite the empire surviving arrests and investigations, it collapsed the same way many criminal empires do, not because they ran out of money, but because someone eventually followed the trail. This has been Dark Hour Docs, and thank you for watching.